Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I'm really glad you're here today because we're diving into a dark but incredibly fascinating era of world history. We're going to examine how the massive, unprecedented crises right after World War I actually paved the way for totalitarianism. Now, it's a heavy subject, for sure, but understanding the actual mechanics of how these regimes took root, it's absolutely crucial. So let's jump into the sources and decode this blueprint of tyranny together.
Just listen to this quote for a second. Everything for the state, everything within the state, and nothing outside the state. It's chilling, right? That quote comes directly from our source material, and it perfectly captures the core totalitarian mindset we're looking at today. We're talking about regimes where the total behavior of everyday citizens was dictated entirely from the top down.
Okay, here is our game plan for today. Section 1, the post-war democratic crisis. 2, Italy's path to fascism. 3, Germany's fall to Nazism. 4, parallels in dictatorship. And finally, 5, the cost of totalitarianism. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the post-war democratic crisis. So, if we look at the decade right after the First World War, roughly 1919 to 1929, there was actually some early democratic progress, but it completely stalled out. Instead, what we see are these totalitarian regimes popping up in Russia, Italy, Germany, and Spain. Our sources point out that these nations basically flat out refused to work with the League of Nations on anything but their own terms. Ultimately, they were entirely willing to sacrifice individual rights for the sake of the state. It's wild how fast things shifted.
Section 2. Italy's path to fascism.
First up, let's define what we're actually talking about here. The word fascism comes from the Italian word fascio, which translates to union or league. But in practice, it means an autocracy, a dictatorship where all state power is handed over to just one man. And objectively speaking, the sources describe it as an intensely nationalistic, anti-communist, and strictly anti-democratic movement.
Now, the visual symbol the fascist chose is super revealing. It's the ancient Roman fasces. It is literally a bundle of sticks bound really tightly around an axe. They adopted this because it's the perfect metaphor for their brand of power. The sticks represent civic unity, while the axe represents the brutal, absolute authority of officials to punish anyone who steps out of line. It's basically a literal blueprint for absolute authority.
But how does something so extreme actually take root? Well, in Italy, it was a perfect storm of grievances. Even though Italy fought with the Allies, they felt totally cheated out of the territories they expected from the Treaty of Versailles. Combine that huge national frustration with a crippling economic crisis. Trade was ruined, unemployment was massive, and there were even shortages of food grains. On top of that, you've got elections failing to provide any real leadership since 1919, plus a growing genuine fear of the international communist movement. The entire country was essentially paralyzed and desperate for a fix.
And this historical newspaper headline really grounds that moment in reality. Black shirt leader enters Rome as hero. Mussolini literally marched on Rome, and instead of stopping him, Emperor Victor Emmanuel III actually invited him to form a new government. Just like that, under the guise of restoring order, Mussolini was handed dictatorial powers.
Section 3, Germany's fall to Nazism. Now, if you thought Italy's shift was fast, the sheer pace of Germany's democratic collapse is just staggering. The Weimar Republic was formed in 1919, but from then until 1933, the country suffered through absolute political chaos. Get this, the sources note they went through 21 different ministries in that short window. 21! The coalition governments just couldn't cope. This massive public anger paved a remarkably swift path. By January 1933, Adolf Hitler is offered the chancellorship, and just 1 year later, he completely abolishes the constitution and takes absolute dictatorial power as the Führer.
And the triggers here, they share a striking DNA with what we just saw in Italy. We've got the deeply humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which forced Germany into massive reparations and land losses. There was also that exact same dread of communism paired with an economic crisis that was just devastating. To put it in perspective, by 1931, debts for German farmers alone had skyrocketed to $300 million. So you take this profound economic misery, mix in a resurgence of militant nationalism, and add highly aggressive anti-Semitic propaganda, and it was systematically exploited to manipulate a desperate public.
Of course, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party, better known as the Nazis, didn't just rely on political maneuvering. They brought intimidation right out into the open.
They actually utilized their own private armies to violently crush opposition and protect their leaders. You had one faction famously wearing brown shirts to bust up opposition meetings, and another wearing black shirts as security for party bosses. It was physical force, plain and simple.
Section 4. Parallels in dictatorship. So, let's put these two movements side by side. The blueprints are built on virtually identical foundations. Both exploited historical grievances, specifically anger over the Treaty of Versailles. Both weaponized terrible economic conditions, featuring massive unemployment and ruined trade. They both preyed on societal fears, pushing a hatred for the slow pace of democracy and a heavy fear of communism. And finally, both took full advantage of a chaotic political climate and the overall failure of the League of Nations.
Philosophically, the overlap is undeniable. Fascist ideology was built strictly around one party and one leader rule, while Nazi ideology equally demanded total state supremacy over all individual rights. Different geographical borders, different leaders, but identical end goals: aggressive imperialism, a total disdain for democracy, and elevating the state way, way above any basic human freedoms.
Section 5. The cost of totalitarianism.
Okay, so what happens when these regimes actually consolidate power? The cost to society was immediate, and it was brutal. Both regimes completely ended civil liberties. Suspected opponents weren't just debated, they were treated incredibly harshly, crushed or eliminated altogether. There was strict mandated censorship on everything: books, the press, cinema. In Italy, they entirely abolished the basic justice of the jury system, replacing it with special state courts. In Germany, anti-Nazi books were literally thrown into fires. This was the terrifying, oppressive reality of life under these powers.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer and leaves us with a really heavy but crucial question. When democratic institutions fail to solve severe economic and social crises, how do we prevent history's darkest blueprints from being reused? Recognizing these universal warning signs of fragile democracies is exactly why digging into this history matters so much today. Thank you so much for hanging out and exploring this with me. I really hope this helped clarify how these massive historical shifts happen, and I'll catch you on the next one.